Okay, so my name is Sean McGinley. I'm a customer success engineer here at Moveworks, and welcome to the Creator Studio weekly webinar. Today, our topic is going to be covering Snowflake table queries with Creator Studio. Tune in next week for Salesforce account lookups, and then the week after that for ServiceNow CMDB queries. So for today's agenda, we're going to look at how to query tables within Snowflake using Creator Studio, and then we're going to talk about some enablement and have a Q&A session at the end. So Snowflake table queries with Creator Studio. In this example, I'm going to have a table in Snowflake. So for those unaware, Snowflake is a database and big data tool that allows you to write SQL queries, build tables, build databases. And in this webinar, we're going to go through an example of allowing end users to query data from a table within our Snowflake instance. So in this example, I have a Snowflake instance that has a table within it that has a list and information about all the offices that my organization has. So this includes their address, the city, state, and country that they're located within, as well as their postal code. So because I have all this information in my Snowflake instance, I can build a SQL query and an API call to allow users to access rows within that table. So this is what it would look like to an end user. If they want to be able to ask, I need to go into an office next week, what's the address of that office? We can use natural language processing to extract our slot. So our slot is going to be our variable that we're going to use to query our API to get the relevant result back. So we're going to extract Dubai from this question, and then we're going to plug it into a SQL query that we're going to use to make a call to the Snowflake API. And the Snowflake API is going to return the relevant row from that table to give us the additional information that we have in our select statement. So let's hop into the demo. So for the demo, I want to show you all of the pieces that we have in conjunction. So let me sign into my Snowflake instance very quickly. I'm going to pull this into another tab for that. Okay. So in my Snowflake instance, I have two main items that I'm going to be using in this webinar. So one is my OAuth authentication creator. So this is a worksheet in my Snowflake instance, and the logic in this worksheet is what allows me to build the OAuth connector that I need to use to connect this instance to Moveworks Creator Studio. So I'm not going to step through this because it's going to require me to parse through the secrets and the client information, and that's not something I want to do in a public forum. But if I execute this code, what would happen is I would be given all of the information that I need to build an OAuth call so that I can authenticate into this instance via API. We also have an authentication guide that walks through every step that you're going to need to take to be able to authenticate into Snowflake using Creator Studio. So going through this step by step, we need to set our default role to sysadmin. This is what's going to allow us to create an OAuth connector that we can actually use to make API calls. The type will have to be OAuth. The OAuth client will be custom, and the client type will be confidential. The redirect URI is a URL that we are going to be redirected to get a code value that we are going to need to then authenticate into the instance. Everything here is just in regard to showing you as the end user the information that you actually need to build that authentication. So this will show you the client ID, the client secret, and the token access endpoints. So I'm going to pull up Postman. And here I have some Snowflake queries built out. So after we create our OAuth connector, we're going to be given a couple of different variables. So one is going to be our client ID, which we can plug in here, and our client secret. We're also going to be given a redirect URL. This is just going to be the URL that we plug in that we're going to be redirected to get our code. And then we're going to have to use this OAuth token request endpoint, which is always just going to be your Snowflake base URL and then OAuth token request. After you do this, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to build a URL in this format. So it's going to be your base URL with the authorization endpoint, the response type, your client ID, and then your redirect URL. And your client ID and your redirect URL need to be encoded, or this won't work. When you craft this URL, you can then paste it into a web browser, and that will bring you into a Snowflake login page. There you can log in using your system administrator account. And once you do that, you'll be redirected to the URL that you have defined in your redirect URI with a code block at the end of it. And that code block is what you're going to add as the code in your body. And then when you send this request, you'll get a refresh token. That refresh token will have some time to live associated with it. So by default, it's 90 days. And with that refresh token, we can build our authentication for Creator Studio. Before we go into Creator Studio, let's just confirm that our refresh token is currently working. So our refresh token allows us to then get an access token. The access token is the token that we actually use to make API calls into our Snowflake instance. So I'm going to hide the response because I don't want to show my refresh token and I don't want to show my access tokens. But if I send this call, we do get a valid response back. I can see that I have a status 200. And using my Postman scripts, I'm actually saving this access token into my environment so that I can use it to query the Snowflake API. So if I go to query office by city, which is the call that we're going to want to build out in Creator Studio, and I send this, I can see that I'm getting a valid response back with that token that I just generated, which means that the auth, as I have created it, is working, and I will be able to use it within Creator Studio. In this response, I can also start to get an idea of what my data looks like when it's returned back to me. So I can see that I have a row, or I have an object data that is a nested list. And within there, I get a result back for my query where I can see that the city is Dubai, and I can see other information related to that row in the table. So the address, the name of the office, the country that it resides in, things like that, which is all information that I want to be able to present back to the user when they ask for office information. So now that I know that my API and my connectors are working, I can hop into Creator Studio. Oh, but first, let's look at our schema for our table. So in here, I've just generated some random example information. So I have about 20 to 30 rows here, where the majority of this information is populated in each row. So the idea here is that if I have some table in Snowflake that has information that is going to be relevant to my users, that I want them to be able to query other columns within, I can have this table construction within Snowflake, and I can pick a variable that it would make sense for the user to be able to query by. So in this case, city. And when they ask our Moveworks bot for information about the office in a given city, we will then go, okay, submit the SQL statement with the city that they've given us and pull the relevant row back and present them the information that they've asked for. So our next step is going to be going into Creator Studio. So to get into Creator Studio, you should be able to access it through your My Moveworks tile and your identity system. And then you should have this menu where you can access Creator Studio connectors and then create a new one. So in here, I've already created this connector because I need to be able to pull secret and token information that I don't want to show in a public platform. But at a high level, this is what the content will look like. We'll have a base URL. Our auth config will be OAuth2, and our grant type will be refresh token grant. So this is exactly the same way that we have it in our first API call in Postman to get the refresh token. We're going to have our client ID that we pulled from our OAuth creation in Snowflake, and then we're going to have our client secret and our refresh token. This refresh token is the value that is provided in that first API call. So after we generate the code and do the redirect URL, we're granted a refresh token. And that refresh token, again, is what we're going to be using to get our access tokens when we need to actually make the API call. We can leave the refresh token grant scope empty, and then the OAuth token URL is always going to be your base URL /OAuth/token request. For the OAuth2 client authentication, we're going to select basic auth header set to client ID and client secret, because that's what our headers are in Postman when we make the call. And the JSON expires in key. So how long does this token last before it expires? How is that defined in the API response? It's defined in the key format expires_in. And this format is in seconds. Everything else here we can leave blank. We have no need to fill it out. So the only thing that is invisible here is going to be our refresh token and our client secret. Everything else you can mimic, just supporting, just replacing it with the values from your specific system. So now that we have our connector built out, let's go into Creator Studio and go into queries. The reason that we're doing queries is because this is a lookup. So when a user asks a question, all we're going to do is we're going to make a single API call to look up information based on the question that they're asking and return it to them with no follow-up action. So I'm going to make my query label something that is distinct and very clear what the use case is and what it's for. So I'm going to make it look up office information by city. Allow users to query office information by providing city from Snowflake. And then I'm going to choose my connector. So the one that I created for this is just called Creator Studio Webinar Snowflake. And this is just referencing this connector. Next, I need to specify my API endpoint path in my method. So looking at our Postman call and the Snowflake API, we can see that we need to do a post call, and that post call is going to go to this endpoint. So /API/2/statements is the endpoint that we need to query. This statements endpoint is what allows us to plug in a SQL query directly into Snowflake to retrieve some data. And then our method here is going to be post. For the request body, we're going to want to copy everything that we have here. So Snowflake requires you to set the database, the schema, and the warehouse. So this is going to be dependent on your instance. Compute, all of these are something that should be created, and you'll have multiple selections. So the schema is what tables are associated with it. The database is what is the actual content based on the schema and the tables within that. And all of that will be visible in your Snowflake instance by going into the databases. So right now we have this hard-coded where the city is going to equal Dubai. So if I actually leave this as is, I'm going to add the header, accept application/JSON, and then I'm going to test this. So we do need to have this header. All this header is doing is essentially saying that the format that we have our request body in is going to be JSON. Interesting. This is probably a timeout issue, so I'm just going to refresh. And re-authenticate into this. We go here and create. So this is going to take this. So again, we can take our API call. It's going to be post. I'm going to take my request body and paste it in here. And then again, we're going to do accept applications/JSON. And then we're going to test this. And we get a response code 200. So that means that this call worked as expected, and we can see that it's returning the same data that we see in Postman. So I want users to be able to query for any city that we have an office in. I don't want them to only be able to query for Dubai. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this a variable by using this syntax. So double open curly brace and close curly brace and the word query. So what this does is it allows us to extract the city that the user is actually looking for the office within from the question that they've asked Moveworks. So when I put a query variable here, I can then provide an example value to slot. And if I enter Dubai here, we get the same result. And if I go back to my Snowflake table and I pull one of the other cities that I have defined here to test that out, I can confirm that we're actually properly slotting in this variable correctly. So that when a user asks the question, no matter what city they're referencing, as long as we have a representation of that city in our Snowflake table, we'll still be able to serve back the relevant information. And we can see here that I'm still returning this data object, and I'm getting all of the information that I need for it, and it's proper and related to my query. So now that I know that this is correct, I can go to next. And now we're in our API labeling section. So what this section allows us to do is define what information is going to be available for Moveworks to show to the end user based on this API call. Because of the format of the Snowflake API response, we're going to want to switch to advanced mode here. And then we're going to want to be very considerate of what the format of our response object actually is. So looking at Postman, we see that we're returning this JSON object, and then within this JSON object, we have this data block. All the information that's relevant to us in this case is in this data block. And we're going to want to define an identifier and a description, and then some additional field information for these other rows. So because of the format that this data is in, we can reference it using JSON syntax like this. So .0 is referencing the first entry in this list, which is this entire object. And then if I want to be able to then reference a value in this list, I need to .walk again. So .0 refers to this item here. .0.1 refers to the street address, etc. So in this case, we're going to want to ensure that we map all of the rows into the additional fields and the identifier information that we have set up here. So in this case, I want the office name to be our identifier. I want the street name to be our description. And then I'm going to add additional fields for all the other elements of this response that I may want to present to a user. So data.0.0. It's going to be country. The address again is going to be data.0.1. And the reason that I define address twice, one is the description and one is an additional field, is because I want to build this logical pairing for Moveworks, where when it sees this variable in the response object, it understands that that's the address of this office. Then we're also going to want to add the office name, which is going to be data.0.2, the state, data.0.3. Tree will be data.0.4. City data.0.5. And then finally postal code data.0.6. So now I've defined every element of my response that I want users to be able to see. Gonna hit next. I have no follow-up action here. I just want to return the information that's relevant to the user. And then I'm going to look at the triggering and lookup keywords that are automatically generated as example queries and make sure that they're relevant to the questions that I think users will be asking. So what is the office information for Techville? Where is the Techville office located? What is the address of the Techville office? These are all perfect examples of what I would want a user to ask to be able to get a response from this call. Can you provide the details? Tell me more about the office. What is the postal code? So asking for specific information or specific column from this table. What state? So this is why it's important that we labeled all of the results from our data object, because this is what allows us to generate these sample queries. So it knows that the information that's contained within here includes the state, postal code, country, etc. And these are all good examples of what I would want a user to be able to ask. Now I'm going to select my launch option. As this is my first time implementing this, I'm going to only want to launch it to myself and confirm that it's working as expected. So my email address is jmcginley@moveworks.ai. I'm going to launch this. Okay, I'm going to give that a minute to propagate. Because we're low on time, I'm going to go through the rest of the deck and talk about how to learn more. If you're interested in learning more about Creator Studio, I highly recommend taking our Creator Studio Developer Certification. This is on our Academy site. Here we have guided training modules that cover key concepts and learning objectives. We have step-by-step videos detailing the key use cases of Creator Studio and showing examples of how to do them. And at the end, you can get a certification by taking a multiple choice exam to test your knowledge, and then you can display that certification on your LinkedIn profile. I also recommend checking out our documentation and developer community. So we have a lot of documentation about Creator Studio, all the functionality that's currently available. We have authentication guides. We have tutorials for straightforward use cases that you can then build off of and expand. We also have our community page, which allows you to interact with other Moveworks customers and talk to other developers. You can also ask questions there about the product and get feedback from people like myself, so customer success engineers who work with this product every day, as well as some of the product managers themselves, so that they can give you information on questions that you may have pertaining to future releases or questions about why some things were built in the manner that they are to get that additional information and insight. Okay. So now let me show you my interaction with my Moveworks bot. So I can see that this is now propagating successfully. So if I ask, what is the address of our Dubai office? It will tell me the address of our Dubai office, known as the Middle East office, is 1212 Pioneer Ave, Dubai, UAE. So if I then ask, so we can see that it's working on it. We're going to see that it is going to be referencing lookup in office information by city, which is the business query that we configured. And then again, it's returning the rows that are relevant to that query. So any city that I have in my Snowflake table will now be able to query by. And you can expand this, right? So whatever table that you have in Snowflake that it would make sense for end users to be able to query, as long as you can construct this API authentication, build the connector out, and get this response back in Creator Studio, you can start to create these instances where users are able to ask questions, where they're just asking for information, where they just give you maybe a single column of data, and then you can return all the information in that row that's relevant to that question. And finally, I want to open it up for any Q&A.